I didn't really think of myself as anything but an actor. I also knew that I could give some honor to the profession of acting.
I heard these stories that you used to set your alarm to wake up in the middle of the night to watch movies so you could study, and that you also would monitor your own emotions.
If you're good, you have an insight into people's behavior that is slightly more than the issue of can you see the motivation? Can you see the reason why you might know more? And I did.
Is this your life's work? Is this the most important thing you think you will do in your life, this work on civics?
Yes, what I'm doing in terms of civics is the most important thing that I am spending my life on. I'm doing something to save my country. We're an amazing accident of history. If you can say that you have America in your blood, you are accepting a compliment that it was a massive compliment, a massive miracle of forward thinking.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Richard Dreyfuss, the Hollywood actor who starred in some of the most successful movies of all time. Your career has spanned an incredible 50 years and includes standout performances in films like American Graffiti, Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and The Goodbye Girl, for which you won the Oscar for Best Actor, becoming the youngest ever to win at age 30. During a 5-year period in the 1970s, your movies grossed $1 billion at the box office, making you one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. Your nonprofit organization, the Dreyfuss Civics Initiative, endorses the need for civics education in schools to ensure that future generations appreciate the power of their citizenship and the principles that hold America together. Your new book, One Thought Scares Me, explores the failing democratic republic in the United States and outlines a clear path to reclaiming American ideals. Richard, welcome to London Real.
Hiya. Thank you.
It's great to have you here. I got to ask, how is my hometown of San Diego? I notice you're there and not in LA. Obviously, I'm in London. Feels like maybe we should be roles reversed, but how is San Diego treating you?
San Diego is becoming more and more civilized every day. And you get to meet the strangest and most wonderful people. I spent the first 6 months having an ongoing debate between myself and Japanese scholars who wanted to know why I took so long to study the way they study. And I said, well, I thought you were already doing it right. And they said, no one's doing it right. And that kind of put a shiver down the back of my neck. And I realized that, yes, no one was doing this correctly. And so I was at St. Anthony's, which is the school at Oxford that receives foreign students. And I found out, not quite a student and not quite a faculty, but I could dip into both, and I learned a lot. I had been a Cambridge lecturer for many years as I came in and out of town. But the day that for instance, the day that I told the cab driver that I was here to see the Queen's reaction to Close Encounters of the Third Kind, I had never seen horizontal tears until that minute. And he cried with such passion that they went bing, and they went right to the front window, and he was speechless.
And this is what you said when you got to Oxford to spend your 4 years over here.
Yeah. Yeah. They asked me, do you have a project that we could approve or disapprove of? And I said, yes. And it was in and around the subject of civics. And I had discovered that, unbeknownst to me, civics was not being taught at all. And so how they expected to create a civil society, that was something I was really looking forward to understanding. And I found it. And I found it all over the place. So it was something very cherishable. And I got more out of that first year. So.
And I really want to jump into, the meat of the book and a lot of the thoughts that you have in there. But I think a lot of it seems to be framed with your family history. And I'm wondering if we can maybe touch on that, because, your family emigrated from various parts of Europe, and I know they were all of the American left. And then they had this kind of fascinating journey of like gangs of New York, and they went to the war. And I feel like somehow that DNA is somehow in the book and your thoughts on this. I was wondering if you could speak on kind of the Dreyfuss clan and where they came from, what their values are, and how that shapes your perspective of why we need civics today.
Well, actually, I said to my father when I was in my 20s that sooner or later I knew that I was going to be asked to write an autobiography. And I said, that autobiography will say that I was born in 1881, because that's the year that all of the stories began that really shaped my moral character. And I knew who and why and when. And so it was a group effort, and well worth it. Well worth it.
And is it true that your great-great-grandmother was kind of involved in an assassination in Russia, and she kind of had to flee, and there was a lot of excitement and drama in your family? I guess I shouldn't be surprised knowing you.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, there was, I have the rare privilege of being able to say, my great aunt, Helsia Helfman, a member of the Narodnaya Volnya, the will of the people, along with Alexander Lenin, Nikolai's older brother, they assassinated Tsar Alexander in 1881. I'd like to say that again. My great aunt, Helsia, she was an activist, oh boy. And so she came out of the shtetl and popped Alexander. And because of the privileges that came along with his caste and class, he very easily would have been able to get away without selling the prison time or the execution, but he didn't want to. And so he willingly was hung, and Helsia was not, because even the Okrana, the secret police, even the Okrana did not kill pregnant women. And so she was exiled to New York. And she went into Ellis Island being Helsia Helfman, and she came out a few minutes later known as Elsie Hoffman, which was the exact name of my grandmother. And my grandmother was Helsia's niece. And if the Irish clerk on Ellis Island had any trouble at all in pronouncing her name, they changed it, and that's what they did. So her Helsia became Elsie, and her Helpman became Hoffman. And so she came in one way and went out the other. And I wish I had known her personally, but I didn't.
And then your father went to the war, but before that, there was kind of a little bit of a gangs in New York scenario kind of happening in Brooklyn. And just, you said that they were kind of all of the left. And I'm just wondering how some of those pieces kind of shaped who you became. You were born in 47, I think. How did that all change you?
Well, it was an enormous impact on my life. And I can say that if that had not been the case, I would not be here, and I would not have received the melodrama of her life as part of mine. And she was a tough little bird, apparently, and she had every right and reason to circle this central drama. She was my own Thoreau, because there's this famous story about Thoreau refusing to pay the taxes for the Mexican War, and Ralph Waldo Emerson visits him in the jail, and he says, "Henry, what are you doing in there?" And Thoreau looked at him and said, "Ralph, what are you doing out there?" So
it's yeah, very fitting on times like they are today as well, right? That story.
Yes. And then my mother, my grandmother, was a upfront witness to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which was one of those catastrophes that kept plaguing the newly arrived immigrants. And you couldn't avoid that catastrophe, that terrible event. And my grandmother, who was only 11 or 12, came upon the remnants of that awful pile of death, 154 girls, all from Eastern Europe, and just then learning the mechanics of learning English, and they had none. She had to learn, and very quickly, because they gave her no allowance for the time spent on her English lessons. And so the reason that they say that they gave for locking up the windows to get to the fire escapes is because that they were taking too many cigarette breaks. And so they locked the windows from the outside. And that was the doom of those women. And I grieve for that experience and for those girls. But they were also beyond belief. They had created a mythical series of images of gods and goddesses, because as they stepped out and their hair, which was their prize, their hair was burning. And with the sun coming in from behind them, they looked like the goddesses of the Norse trilogy. And that lasted for a half second. And then they held hands and stepped out onto nothing. And they then, holding hands, because they loved each other and they loved about to do. These girls who hardly had time to store their toothbrushes, 154 of them stepped out into nothing, and they were betrayed by that nothing. And they fell right at my grandmother's feet. I shouldn't say grandmother, but as they fell, they changed from being a majestic picture of gods and goddesses to the wrecked remnant of crows, all in black and all dead. They fell 19 floors, and there was nothing that anyone could do. And that's that.
Wow.
My grandmother, the story goes, turned around and went directly to the Socialist Party headquarters, and she eventually became Eugene Debs' private secretary. And that was a name that all of us knew and revered. And that's who she was.
Have you ever
I see her all the time. Whenever I'm called upon to do something political, or do you have anything to say about this, Richard? I can hear her.
And what does she say to you when, say in 2004, you decide you're no longer a Democrat? What does she say? I'm curious.
Well, my grandmother and my mother and her sisters all were intensely proud of the fact that they had never voted for a winner. And they didn't think of themselves as FDR's liberals. They thought of themselves as immigrant girls who knew they had one shot, one moment of life left to them. And they took it and died on the pavement.
And but I guess what I was trying to ask, would she understand your change in politics? Would you be able to have a conversation with her about it? And would she understand your mindset and methodology? I don't know. You say you talk to her sometimes. I'm just curious if you ever had that conversation with her and what she might say.
I've had similar conversations with many people, all of my neighbors, because my father was the leader of a Jewish gang in Brooklyn, and he fought the Italian gangs and the Irish gangs, and they moved a lot. They moved from one ethnic corner to another. And they were very, very proud of that. And I can't express this really as well as I might, but I was incredibly proud of my father's pre-war war. And there was a great deal of violence and death and stories about someone grabbing a radio antenna off of a car and sticking it in his opponent's eyes. And then when Hitler made his second act appearance, they all knew that they were going, and that they were going to specifically kill him and his ideas. And that was the trope of that moment.
And how
My wife, pick up your tempo.
how does that all affect Richard Dreyfuss? How does that get all boiled down into a young man? Were you angry? Were you violent? Were you proud? I'm just curious.
I was not violent, but I was active, and I was active in a very political way. And I knew that my family was connected to the human race in some pretty melodramatic ways. I am related to Captain Alfred Dreyfuss. I am related to the killer of the Tsar. And I learned that my life was a connective tissue to the politics of the 19th century, both in Europe and in America.
And yet you chose to pursue acting. Had you ever thought about going into politics?
Only afterwards. Okay. I didn't really think of myself as anything but an actor. I also knew that I could give some honor to the profession of acting, and I did. I think actors have a step up that other people don't realize. When you're an actor, you have to really study the people who also were actors. And if you're good as an actor, you you have an insight into people's behavior that is slightly more than the issue of can you see the motivation? Can you see the reason why you might know more? And I did. I played various people who had mice, and I knew why, and I was very proud of that it gave me an insight into some human behavior that I could justify. And I never wanted to play villains because it would have meant that I would have misused the knowledge that I had. So I played Dick Cheney, and someone said, "How could you play Dick Cheney?" And I said, "How could I not?" And there's a little bit of Cheney in all of us. And I totally, completely believe that. And it's also the fact that I was a history buff, and I knew about the immigrant experience in America. And there's never been a country that offered itself as a destination, as a goal, and took power from a king and spread it so well. And you don't find that impulse in everyone. And I was born in 1881, and everything that happened to my family, my grandfather and his brothers, who worked for Waxy Gordon, and my uncles, who all were either communists or socialists. I went to my mother once and I said, "Why were you a communist? Why were you a socialist and not a communist?" And she said, "Better donuts." And so I had to be what I was. I was the recipient of all of my family's political activism. And I could always spot my grandmother sitting in the back. And she was known as Big Grandma. And she said to me one day when we were listening to the radio and hearing about an exhibit that Man Ray was giving at the museum, he was the worst stickball player that she ever played with. And I said, "Really?" And she said, "Yes, and there's no mystery about his name." There had been, of course, a terrible mystery. How did he get that name? And she looked at me and said, "Emanuel Rabinowitz, Man Ray." I get it.
There you
go.
And you said earlier, as an actor, it's almost like you have more of an emotional intelligence than maybe other people did. So you almost had a superpower in kind of understanding people's behaviors and seeing things maybe that other people didn't see. Am I getting that right? Or being able to kind of unlock things that other people can't unlock. And you wanted to use it responsibly, not as a villain, but in other ways.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly right.
And I heard these stories that you used to set your alarm to wake up in the middle of the night to watch movies so you could study, and that you also would monitor your own emotions. So like if your brother made you cry, you would notice that emotion and go into the bathroom and then try to repeat that emotion and then try to repeat it again. Are the rumors true, Richard? Is this what you used to do?
Yeah, and it's what I do now. It's the way to acknowledge that you can step out of your life, observe your life, and find value in that active quality. And that's why I had the heroes that I had, Clarence Darrow and various justices, and I wanted to be what I called a witness. I have no real, I have no standing as a witness, but I am a witness to the world as I came to know it. And I was as connected to the human race as you could possibly be. So that made me a perfect actor and a perfect actor's friend.
And you've talked about, you know, yourself, and you say you don't like to use the word bipolar. You like the term manic depressive, and I'm wondering if that even further connects you sometimes to the points in the book or to the human race, or I mean, even to your roles on screen. I can't think of, you seem to me to be the first actor that ever brought that into the roles in such a way. I mean, it's in Jaws, it's in Close Encounters. We see this guy who is this kind of manic depressive, and I'm curious if that was intentional when you brought that in, or was that Richard just being Richard? And in those moments, are you ultra connected, I don't know, to the human race?
Well, I'll tell you, when I was asked by George Lucas to appear in American Graffiti, he offered me 2 roles. I could take my pick of 2 roles. One of them was Charlie, the kind of nerdy goofball, smart but a goofball. And the other one was Kurt, the actor, the character who was me. And I chose Kurt, and George said, "Why?" And I said, because Kurt is self-aware. He's aware of who he is in school, in his family, and he had this awareness. And so we designed one moment in the film is all about that. It's about the fact that I try to open up my locker, which is no longer mine, and I don't know the new formula for getting in, and it makes me laugh. And it was just for no real reason my way of expressing that life goes on, and things that you think mean your intimate knowledge of the character is all gone, wiped clean, a whiteboard, and other people now have a closer understanding of that. So I've imposed that quality on almost every character I've ever played.
Yeah, and I see it now. Now I see it in so many of your roles. And I got to tell you a quick story. So almost 11 years ago to this day, I quit my job in banking and I started broadcasting, just like we are here today, having long-form conversations in my kitchen. Nobody was doing it. Everyone thought I was crazy. There was no business model. My friends and family didn't even watch it for years, Richard, years. And, you know, after I stuck with it for 5 years, 10 years, started having some success. And some people said, well, what kept you going? And I always say, you know what? I was a bit like Richard Dreyfuss in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I was building my mashed potatoes, and I didn't know why, but I knew it was something, I was connecting to something bigger. It was going to be part of something bigger, maybe something to do with humanity. But I didn't know what I was doing, and to the outside world, I looked crazy. But then later, it seemed to play a part in this common goal of pushing humanity forward. And that's an analogy I use sometimes, and people look at me in a strange way, and then they usually change the topic. But I thought I'd share that with you.
That is exactly what I say. It's exactly what I say. And I've used that character, Roy Neary, as the perfect example of that, because he does have the courage to go with something that is clearly beyond his understanding. And it actually takes him away from his family.
Yeah.
And especially in those days when we shot the film, one of the things that made it special, and it was special, that this is a character who did something against the wishes and desires of his entire family, his children and his wife. And I would have insisted on that, but I didn't have to, because Stephen completely understood why I wanted to do that.
And so that was you and him kind of collaborating and saying it needed to be that extreme, because she takes the kids and leaves. I mean, that's a very hard thing to happen to a man, and yet you still are honoring this pull to do this thing. And it's visceral. And I think so many people relate because it was so raw, and you didn't really see that in movies back then, like you said.
Yeah, if you had such a compulsion or such an obsession, it was usually explained in some way that made it seem okay. But there was no okay. There was no allowance for that kind of behavior. It was a write-off as far as my wife was concerned. And it was a terrible, damaging moment in my children's lives. But there was no choice. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, there was on the set, a decision was made that allowed me to make a decision that was going to hurt and damage his own reputation, his own feeling of moral correctness. And I said, yes, he is, but he has no choice, none. And if you notice, there's a woman, the last person who is seen in that montage is an old lady. And she's thrilled to be there. And that's my grandmother. Because she's seeing it from an old lady's point of view.
How much of that was acting and how much of that was just Richard?
Well, Stephen is a very open director. He mixes it up with his actors. And there was a lot of Stephen in that characterization. And with my enthusiasm and support, yeah, he loved any idea that kept him Roy Neary and yet allowed him the room to express this odd thing. And it was great.
Did you enjoy making that, or was it also exhausting?
Well, it was both, but certainly I enjoyed it. I was in the grip of an obsession. And many years later, Stephen said that had he been married as the character, or as Stephen, if he'd been married and had children, which he did, he would never have had the same ending. And I said, with all due respect, there was no other ending. And it would have ended in that way. It would have ended with him doing something like getting on that ship that he had to do it. Yeah.
And do you feel like Roy sometimes, especially when you're with your pursuit with and maybe obsession of civics and everything you've been doing for the last, well, coming up on 20 years now since you were here at Oxford? Do you sometimes feel like him?
Yes. I feel like I understand, like those Chinese dolls that fit into one another, and each one is the same doll but bigger and smaller.
Aren't they Russian?
Yeah, Russian. Yes, Russians. I have a Russian wife, and she's correcting me as we go along. And I knew that my life was at various times as big as I thought and never as small as I thought it might be. And I had this enormous image of, you know how people are always saying, I looked up into the universe and I thought how small I was. Well, when I looked up into the universe, I thought how enormous I was. And I would hold to that, knowing that if there were ever such a contest, I would have won the largeness of my interior vision of my mind. You know, I see this vast, enormous thing, which I knew when I was about 12. I knew that I had to.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.